The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, dark money, gerrymandering, and the failure of centrism in the Midwest. Author Dan Kaufman on his book, The Fall of Wisconsin, The Conservative Conquest of a Progressive Bastion and the Future of American Politics. Plus, the Bill Press Show on what could be in store for Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In 2016, Donald Trump became the first Republican nominee to carry this state since 1984. How did that happen? Dan Kaufman is a native of Wisconsin and has covered its politics for years. In his recent book, he follows Wisconsin's political journey from blue to red. It's a story that goes back to the mid-1800s. And we say hello to Dan Kaufman, author of The Fall of Wisconsin, The Conservative Conquest of a Progressive Bastion and the Future of American Politics. Dan Kaufman, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. As the title of your book states, Wisconsin has long been known as a bastion of progressive politics. How far back does that history go?
Well, I think it was formed in the 19th century. There were waves of Scandinavian and German immigrants who kind of helped create this culture. And I'm not sure if your listeners know, but the Republican Party, which was an abolitionist party founded on abolitionist principles, was founded in a one-room schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1854. And that was founded by liberal progressives from Wisconsin, and these immigrant groups gravitated towards it really fiercely. And then that tradition continued, continued its creation and reached its kind of apotheosis at the turn of the 20th century. We can go into some of the accomplishments of that movement, but it goes back to the 19th century.
Robert La Follette, former governor and member of Congress from Wisconsin, was a powerful figure in Wisconsin politics. Tell us about him and his influence.
Well, he was kind of the pivotal figure in Wisconsin. He was governor, senator, district attorney, congressman, and even ran for president as a third-party candidate for a new party that he called the Progressive Party in 1924. And he won 17% of the vote, actually, including his home state. He created a tradition. The Wisconsin legislature was very corrupted at the time by corporate interests, timber and railroad companies specifically. And he ran for governor several times and finally won in 1901. And he created laws to limit this influence of corporations on the state's government. He banned corporate donations to candidates. He also reformed the civil service, so it was no longer just a patronage place for the political parties. And he also instituted direct primaries, which allowed voters to really be involved in their state's government. Probably the most important thing he did was forge a close alliance with the University of Wisconsin. This became called the Wisconsin Idea. And basically, it drew on the expertise of the university's faculty to create laws that would help the state's citizenry as a whole, and we can talk about some of those laws. But he was kind of the pivotal figure to launch this progressive movement in Wisconsin.
Now, there are several examples of progressive policies started in Wisconsin that spread throughout the nation. Tell us about some of those.
Well, and these were some of these I mentioned with La Follette, and they really came. The progressive movement in Wisconsin really came to its high point in the 1911 legislature. Some of the laws passed were the first workers' compensation bill. Prior to that, workers killed on the job, there were thousands each year. Their widows would be destitute, their children destitute, and they would often have to just try to survive by living with relatives and so on. Workers' lives were cheap, and Wisconsin was the place that was first able to pass a successful workers' compensation bill, which became a model for many other states across the country. That was drafted by a professor at the University of Wisconsin named John Kaufman, and it was an example of the Wisconsin idea. Another first in Wisconsin was the first progressive state income tax that was successful. Many states had tried before, but had a lot of difficulty actually collecting money. Wisconsin's version was successful, partly because the tax hit the wealthiest hardest, and it also most of the money was returned to local communities, so people could see the benefits of these policies. The first unemployment insurance program was passed in Wisconsin and became a national model for Franklin Roosevelt, as well as Social Security was drafted by a Wisconsinite loyal to the Wisconsin idea. Much of the New Deal was modeled on programs or the progressive populism that had been very influential in Wisconsin.
We're speaking with Dan Kaufman, author of The Fall of Wisconsin, The Conservative Conquest of a Progressive Bastion and the Future of American Politics, here on the America's Democrats podcast. Dan, looking at more recent history, as you write, the pendulum begins to swing with the election of Scott Walker as governor in 2010. Give us some context to the moment. What allowed Walker to win?
Well, Walker was part of a Tea Party wave, his victory in 2010. There was a lot. First of all, Citizens United had the U.S. Supreme Court decision, which allowed for independent groups, nominally independent groups, to give unlimited sums and took away some of the restrictions on campaign finance, campaign spending. That emboldened a lot of national groups, and Wisconsin was one of many that flipped. There was a lot of unpopularity with, President Obama at the time, and they were able to capitalize on this, partly aided by a lot of outside money that was flowing in. I think that it actually began to swing earlier. Wisconsin, although it has been a progressive bastion, also had moments of conservative, rule. In fact, it voted for Joe McCarthy twice, and there had been Republican governors, and so on and so forth. But I think, money had started to creep into Wisconsin since the late 70s with the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Buckley versus Vallejo. And gradually over time, its politics became more like that of other states, and that reached a really pivotal moment in 2010 when not only Governor Walker won, but both houses of the state legislature were Republican, and that was the first time that had happened in about in quite some time since the late 90s. So.
Well, and what was happening to voters in Wisconsin that made them more open to a conservative message?
I think you had there was deep economic insecurity. I mean, you have to remember, this was the height of the financial crisis still, which had really peaked in 2008, but there was a lot of economic insecurity. And this economic insecurity didn't come out of nowhere. Voters had voted for Barack Obama in 2008. He had trounced McCain by 14 percentage points. But along with that came a deep hope that things might change fundamentally. If you look at rural Wisconsin, it had been eroded for many decades. For example, after the Second World War, there was about 150,000 dairy farms in Wisconsin. Now there's fewer than 9,000. So rural life and rural towns had been depleted for decades. This caused a lot of people to look for answers. And I think the Democratic Party's message had not resonated. It was not a powerful counter message. Governor Walker came about really attacking public employee unions as county executive in Milwaukee. And in a time of economic insecurity, this kind of resentment can be effective. And we'll get to that momentarily. But I think this is what was happening. They were looking for something, and there was a real dramatic drop-off in turnout in those midterm elections, as well as a lot of energy on the right to oppose President Obama and also to capitalize on this moment of economic insecurity.
Mm-hmm. Now, Scott Walker is perhaps most well known for his landmark law called Act 10. What did this law accomplish?
Well, it basically stripped workers, public employees, of their collective bargaining rights. But it did more than that. It basically began a process of deunionizing Wisconsin, which had always been a cradle of the labor movement going back to this progressive era. It was the first state to actually enshrine collective bargaining rights for public employees, and that was achieved for all state employees by a Republican governor in the late 60s, Warren Knowles. So it was a bipartisan tradition of supporting labor rights, and this has been overturned. Now, it was also, I would argue, a political attack on both the unions and the Democratic Party because it made it impossible. It eliminated automatic dues checkoff for public workers, so it starved the unions and the Democratic Party of funds. The unions tended to support the Democratic Party. And I think it has really succeeded also in dividing Wisconsin's citizenry. I'll give you an example. When Walker was inaugurated, he deliberately stoked resentment in this time of economic insecurity. He said in his inaugural address, the public employees can no longer be the haves and the taxpayers the have-nots. And, when you go to some of these rural towns, often the only person with health insurance may be people that work at the school or for the state. So there was a lot of anger in the sense that a lot of people didn't have health insurance or benefits and so on, pensions, and they saw these public workers as having them, and there was nobody really arguing that everyone should have them. And I think that it accomplished a deep division in Wisconsin's body politic that has persisted.
Well, and, John Kasich tried to do the same thing in Ohio with a bill called Senate Bill 5. Voters in Ohio actually forced a repeal of that law. Why didn't that happen in Wisconsin?
Well, simply because Ohio had a mechanism to repeal a specific law. Wisconsin didn't. What Wisconsin did have was a recall process, and petitioners gathered almost 1 million signatures to recall Governor Walker. Unfortunately, there you saw the influence of dark money. Walker vastly outspent his opposing candidate, Tom Barrett, the same candidate that had lost in 2010. And frankly, national Democrats did not engage in the fight to recall Governor Walker. President Obama did not visit Wisconsin to support Mayor Barrett. He's the mayor of Milwaukee. And it resulted in, whereas the conservative forces that were aligned with Governor Walker's attack on the unions were very much supportive of him and saw the importance of this fight. David Koch, the billionaire industrialist who has funded much of the Tea Party, he and his brother Charles, said, Scott Walker's recall election is critically important. He saw it as a national proxy, and they poured a lot of money into it. And he promised that he would pour, a lot of money into it. He said that publicly. So I think that those were the reasons that recall effort failed, and there was no mechanism, as there was in Ohio, as I mentioned, to repeal a specific bill. So this other process was used.
We want you to sit back and listen to this AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with Dan Kaufman, author of The Fall of Wisconsin. Coming up next, how Hillary lost Wisconsin. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Have you noticed that Donald Trump constantly prefaces his outlandish lies with such phrases as, to be honest with you, to tell the truth, and believe me? Why? Because, like a snake oil salesman, he constantly needs to convince himself that he's speaking the truth in order to perform his next lie convincingly. The show must go on and on. In fact, he already ranks as the lyingest president in U.S. history, and that includes Nixon. Trump's biggest whopper is that he's an honest-to-God populist, standing up for America's hard-hit middle class against Wall Street, corporate lobbyists, and moneyed elites. This prevarication has duped many working stiffs into thinking he's their champion. The huckster doubled down on this lie in his inaugural address last year, pompously declaring, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer." That's why a new straight-talking pamphlet by the watchdog group Public Citizen is so important. It exposes the people's champion as a rank fraud who is pushed from day one to further enrich and empower corporate elites he had denounced as a candidate. Public Citizen's report documents with concise, easy-to-grasp specifics how Trump, the faux populist, has systematically sold out the working families whose votes he cynically swiped, handing our government to a kakistocracy of corporate plutocrats. This is Jim Hightower saying, it's not merely that he's an irredeemable liar, but that Trump himself is a lie. The Public Citizen expose is titled, Forgetting the Forgotten, 101 Ways Donald Trump Has Betrayed the Middle Class, and it drives the stake of truth through the heart of his populist pretensions. Don't just read it. Use it like a Thomas Paine pamphlet to spread the truth. To download a free copy, go to corporatepresidency.org/forgotten.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Still with us is Dan Kaufman, author of The Fall of Wisconsin, the Conservative Conquest of a Progressive Bastion and the Future of American Politics. Dan, now we come to 2016 and the race for president. Hillary Clinton was the first presidential candidate in over 40 years not to campaign in Wisconsin. This seems like an obvious mistake. How do you understand that decision?
Well, I think like a lot of people, including many in the media, there was an overconfidence that Wisconsin was somehow a blue wall. You know, it had not voted for a Republican candidate since Ronald Reagan's second term in 1984. However, when you looked closely at those elections, for example, in 2004, John Kerry only narrowly defeated George W. Bush. It seems surprising. In the previous elections with President Obama, he had won pretty handily. I think it was overconfidence, and a real misreading of Wisconsin's political past, and particularly the attacks on labor that had begun to change Wisconsin's political culture. I think her campaign really misread the structural effect of deunionizing the state. For example, in 2008, Wisconsin had about 14% union density, and by the time of the 2016 election, it had 8%. Now, these people are some of the most active people in elections, and they also form a context for sharing ideas about policy. So the state's electorate was more atomized than it had been, and I think, but there was a lack of recognition over, Walker's kind of attritional gains in transforming the state's political body politic of Wisconsin, and I think it was a real distance from and a real lack of understanding of these changes that led her to that decision.
What other ways did Hillary fail to connect to Wisconsin voters?
Well, a huge way is her distance from the labor movement. Hillary Clinton had been a board member of Walmart for, in the 1980s and early 1990s. The company is notorious for its anti-labor policies, and she had also supported free trade agreements for decades, including NAFTA and China's admittance to the World Trade Organizations. These policies have a huge salience in the industrial Midwest. People can talk about other factors, automation and so on. But if you go to these places, people driving around will point to this or that factory that was moved to Mexico, and they have been their impact has been particularly acute to non-college educated workers in these areas. Wisconsin, particularly the southeastern portion, which is heavily industrialized, Michigan, Ohio, these places. And I think she had no credibility with labor given her record. So I think that was a huge failure. It did not motivate people. And then on the other hand, and we'll get to this in a minute, that Donald Trump had a different kind of message that did manage to cleave off some of these white working class voters.
So let's talk about Donald Trump. We'll turn the tables here. Why was Donald Trump so effective in Wisconsin?
Well, I think partly because he twinned a message with this sort of horrific racial and nativist resentment with some core Democratic messaging. If you look at his speeches in Wisconsin, he staged 5 large rallies there during the general election. And again, Clinton did not appear once. You saw in those rallies, he also mentioned defending Social Security and Medicare and attacking, railing against these free trade agreements. So he did have some success at cleaving off some white working class voters. Hillary Clinton actually did better in some of the wealthier suburban counties around Milwaukee, whereas Donald Trump flipped some working class counties like Kenosha, which Obama had won handily, and Trump had narrowly won. These are places that have been really hollowed out. A big part of their hollowing out is by these free trade agreements. And again, she had very little credibility to criticize them. She did, in the later stages during her campaign, come out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but she had praised it 35 times before. So she didn't have a lot of enthusiasm among a kind of grassroots progressive movement that was steeped in the La Follette tradition and had really supported Bernie Sanders during the primary. He won the primary by 13 points in Wisconsin. I think it was one of the most successful states for his kind of message.
What was the significance of redistricting in this election?
Well, redistricting doesn't affect a presidential election per se. It does affect the state legislature, and it does affect morale, I suppose you could say, because Wisconsin Democrats have gotten nowhere in blocking any of these policies that have transformed the electorate. For example, the right to work policy. That was passed in 2015, and that is something that attacks private sector unions. It basically makes paying union dues. It allows people to opt out of paying union dues, but not. But the union is still obligated to represent all workers in a bargaining unit. That can diminish over time the union's strength, causing more and more people to opt out. So how does this affect redistricting? In 2012, Assembly Democrats won almost 200,000 more votes in aggregate than Republicans, and yet they lost a seat. They were stuck at 39 seats to 60. So again, they were unable to block any of these policies that came about later. And the Republican hold on power was almost assured, making them almost impervious to elections in the state legislature. In the governor's race and presidential contest, it's different because those are statewide contests. But they did affect the morale of the Democratic Party, and it did affect the success of the attacks on unions that did kind of transform the electorate to a certain degree.
What does Wisconsin tell us about our nation as a whole?
Well, I think it tells us a lot. I mean, it's become a laboratory for conservative interests. They have had a huge amount of success at replicating some of these policies. For example, in Iowa, after Republicans seized the governorship and both houses of the state legislature right after the presidential election in 2016, they immediately passed an extreme version of Act 10 that even included police and fire department units, which Walker had exempted to a certain degree. And they have done this because these are successful political attacks. Nobody understood that better than Grover Norquist, the anti-tax crusader, who said in 2017, he said this about Act 10. He said, Donald Trump's unexpected victory in 2016 did not lay the groundwork for Republican political dominance, but the March 2011 signing of Act 10, a dramatic reform of public sector labor laws by Wisconsin's Scott Walker, certainly did. To understate it, if Act 10 is enacted in a dozen more states, the modern Democratic Party will cease to be a competitive power in American politics. It's that big a deal. So I think there is something to your answer that Wisconsin is a bellwether. It's the canary in the coal mine, and some of these policies that have been passed have been replicated and are continuing to being attempted to. And I think as they do become replicated, they have been successful at transforming the state's political culture to a degree. I don't necessarily think that's permanent or irreversible, but I think it is significant.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dan, of course, you're not a political strategist, but what do you want politicians to learn from this book?
Well, again, I'm a journalist, and I report what I see and what I find. I don't like to be a prognosticator or put myself into that role. I do think that it's important to understand that politics is not just who is this charismatic political figure that's running for president. My book details a street-level view of the political process and the importance of what Bob La Follette, he tried to encourage active citizenship. He felt that was essential to preserving democracy. And I tend to agree. I think that active citizenship is important, and I think, I think it's important to remember that what happens in the states and at the ground level is crucially important to what happens on the bigger stage. And the presidential politics is not the only thing that matters. In fact, I would say it matters much less than what happens at the ground level. You can see that in the results to 2016, how these state-based policies really paved the way for Donald Trump's victory. And I think that the Democratic Party has ignored the states for a long time, and that came back to haunt them in 2016. And
ends up being a nice slap in the face, I guess, as we head into the midterms.
That's right. Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, I think, politics is always a moving target, so it's impossible to be definitive about anything. So.
That's a good point. Dan Kaufman, author of The Fall of Wisconsin, The Conservative Conquest of a Progressive Bastion and the Future of American Politics, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dan, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And this is America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Evan McMorris-Santoro, filling in for Bill Press, talks with Vox reporter Dara Lind about the shifting political fortunes of Jeff Sessions.
You know, who's not having sort of a very, who's not rubbing up against the president right now and purring is Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General.
No.
I talked in the beginning part of the show. We played for people about 20 minutes ago all this audio of the president talking on Fox and Friends about how, terrible Jeff Sessions is. He should have told me he should have recused himself. The DOJ is run by Democrats, all this stuff. He's attacking Jeff Sessions. He's done it before, but he's really amped it up right now, right?
Right. I mean, the thing that it's important to understand about Donald Trump is that he doesn't like firing people himself. He doesn't like confrontation. We actually heard reports of a meeting that Trump had with people, including Sessions, yesterday on prison reform, where some of the reports said everything Donald Trump had been saying didn't come up in person with Sessions. He really doesn't like in-person confrontation. And that means that he doesn't want to fire Sessions on his own. But he appears to have decided that if he bullies
he'll burn him online.
Enough,
he'll burn him online. He won't do it to his face.
Right. But the kind of logic here appears to be that no one can put up with this kind of indignity forever, and that eventually he will get Sessions to pack up and leave on his own. So, we've seen a lot of complaints about specific things the Justice Department has done before, the kind of quote unquote Justice Department that Trump will do on Twitter, but actually sitting down in an interview and saying that, there is no control of the Justice Department. It's not quite, actually saying that he wants Jeff Sessions out explicitly. It's not that far from that. It's a pretty damning take on Sessions' role at the Justice Department in general, which is, of course, ironic because on policy, Sessions is doing more to kind of implement Trumpism than anybody else, especially now that Scott Pruitt is out. He's by far the most policy-effective member of the administration.
Might be the Trumpiest guy in the administration.
Right, and gets literally no respect from the president. Yeah. He has every Rodney Dangerfield clip available to play at his disposal right now.
But just so everybody is clear on this, if the president wanted the Attorney General gone, he could do that by the end of the day today.
Oh my God. All it would take, and we've heard kind of reports from inside the White House that he actually decided to fire Sessions, and the White House counsel Don McGahn talked him out of it. He was supposed to do the thing last year. It's what Trump hasn't yet found is the right person to tell to go fire Sessions, who won't try to talk him out of it, or the kind of chutzpah to go fire Sessions himself. If he did either of those things, Sessions could be out.
Mm-hmm. And in the past, we've seen senators get really upset about this. I mean, we did play a clip of Ben Sasse as well, who was very upset about the idea of the president attacking Sessions. I mean, look, we talked about this earlier. Sessions, a longtime Republican senator, much seniority. Not a particularly well liked senator, I don't think, in terms of he was kind of on the edge of a lot of stuff. He was more to the right. He was a senator,
right?
And
exactly.
the senators like senators,
right? And he wasn't he's not Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz is someone who even when other senators agree with him, they don't like him. Jeff Sessions, and you saw this a lot during the confirmation hearings,
right?
Even senators who had been very opposed to what Sessions had his agenda in Congress, like Lindsey Graham, for example, who, was always staunchly opposed to whatever Sessions was trying to do on immigration and vice versa. They really closed ranks. The GOP Senate conference was very much in favor of getting Sessions into the attorney generalship as soon as possible. And some of that was camaraderie, but also, frankly, some of that was because Donald Trump was still an unknown quantity. They didn't particularly trust him. They knew that Jeff Sessions was going to be a steady hand at the wheel.
Right.
They may not necessarily agree with the direction that wheel was turning, but they wanted to have somebody in there who they respected. And it's been very
right. Early names for AG were like Rudy Giuliani was discussed and Chris Christie. These are real outsiders. So
and even
Jeff Sessions is one of them.
Right. And even, some of the first wave of Trump appointees to other cabinet positions, like Rex Tillerson wasn't a known quantity. Even John Kelly didn't have a ton of experience with Congress and it turns out not to have much respect for Congress. So it was, that there was a lot of respect riding on Sessions, even above and beyond the fact that he was kind of a member of the Senate. But there's been a little less willingness to defend Sessions from people not, Ben Sass, in more recent days.
But we're seeing a shift, you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you tell me about this shift?
So yesterday, Bloomberg News talked to two really key senators. They talked to Chuck Grassley, who's the current head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which means if hypothetically there were another attorney general nominee, it would have to go through Grassley's committee. And then they talked to Lindsey Graham, Grassley's going to be retiring after this term, and Graham is probably the likely next head of the Judiciary Committee. So if there was something to happen in 2019, Graham would be the person who would control it. And in the past, Grassley has said, look, I have way too much stuff to do already. I have too many nominees to get through. Remember, that's also the committee that judicial nominees have to go through. I can't deal with an attorney general on top of this. And that was kind of a
sort of signaling.
Exactly.
We don't want the president to fire Jeff Sessions.
This is how senators talk. Senators say this can't be done when they mean I don't want to do this.
That's right.
So, that had kind of been the shot across the bow. And now, for one, Grassley is saying, well, hypothetically, if there were room, hypothetically there is room on my schedule right now, I could deal, that objection no longer applies. I could deal with another nominee. Meanwhile, Graham is out here saying Donald Trump does not have he doesn't have confidence in his attorney general, and a president should have an attorney general that he has confidence in. And so, Graham says it would be a bad idea to do this before the midterms. Don't do it before the midterms. We're busy trying to get Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. But at some point, we might see a new attorney general, which, again, senators say that something can happen when they mean they're okay with it happening. If Lindsey Graham meant he would, stand in the Judiciary Committee room door and prevent a new attorney general nominee from entering, he would say something about it can't be done.
So that shift, while it seems very subtle, is actually a pretty big deal in terms of the fact that someone like Grassley who said, saying I don't want to do this, which was meant don't do it, please.
Right.
Now he's saying, I could do it.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, and you do still hear some people. I mean, it's not just kind of the people who often, critique Trump. John Cornyn, who's the majority whip, was, kind of forceful in saying, look, this can't happen. Again, he was saying it shouldn't happen by saying it can't happen. We probably can't get somebody passed. Susan Collins said we probably couldn't get a new AG passed, meaning she might not vote for him. There are certainly, it's not like they've done the whip count and a new attorney general would definitely get out of the Senate, but a very important roadblock that used to be in the way of if you fire Jeff Sessions, you can't appoint somebody permanently to replace him, which has implications, especially because, remember, the reason that Donald Trump doesn't like Jeff Sessions is because Sessions can't fire Robert Mueller. It's not just that. It's that he broadly recused himself from the Russia investigation, but because of that recusal, he can't fire Mueller.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually want to get into that because I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So a new attorney general isn't Jeff Sessions. He didn't recuse the attorney generalship. So a new attorney general could fire Mueller.
Yeah.
If he were fully appointed. If Trump just kind of put an acting attorney general in there, then it gets kind of complicated because Rod Rosenstein is still in charge of the Mueller investigation, et cetera. But that kind of the inability to appoint a new attorney general is a really important roadblock to firing Sessions if the reason you're firing Sessions is because you want somebody who can fire Mueller.
Right. So in theory, actually changing the AG could in fact have a broad implications on this investigation stuff.
Absolutely.
You could bring somebody in and but again, this is real sort of like political nuclear option stuff. If the president were to fire the AG, to bring in another one that would fire the special counsel. We've seen that movie before. It was called The Saturday Night Massacre.
But the thing
Nixon did it. Did not end well for him.
Right. But the thing is that both of those, it's called The Saturday Night Massacre because both of those happened on the same night. What we haven't seen is a scenario in which, remember this ostensible reason why Jim Comey got fired and how it was because he didn't treat Hillary Clinton very fairly in 2016, right?
Yeah.
There are ostensible reasons that the president could say that Jeff Sessions and he don't agree on things. One example, and arguably the reason that Chuck Grassley has lost patience with Sessions, is because Sessions is staunchly opposed to any criminal justice reform coming out of Congress. And Grassley has kind of walked his way to a compromise on that he now really believes in. Jared Kushner agrees with Grassley on this. Jeff Sessions is opposed. Donald Trump appears to be opposed because Donald Trump, is easily swayed by arguments about you don't want anybody getting out of prison and then killing people. But in theory, you could see a world where Trump says to somebody, come up with a reason, and they say, well, I really believe in criminal justice reform, and my attorney general needs to be on board with that. And so he fires Sessions. Then you have a new confirmation hearing where it's really up to the GOP Senate whether they make a big point of asking, do you believe in the independence of the special counsel's investigation? They ask a lot of hypothetical questions about what would you do if asked to fire XYZ. And maybe they don't press on that, or maybe they press on that and get evasive answers. And then you get someone who is duly confirmed by the Senate who then fires Robert Mueller. That's not a Saturday Night Massacre. That's something that's been, either laundered or validated, depending on your point of view, through a legitimate Senate process.
Yeah, wow, okay. So the Sessions news is actually a pretty big deal. Pay attention to it, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see, right? It's entirely possible that Chuck Grassley was just engaging in a fit of pique, that Lindsey Graham, who's also on board with criminal justice reform, was also just frustrated with Sessions about this. Maybe they'll decide that, after the midterms, they have a different point of view. But that's where we are. And
Dara, you wrote a good story on this. And the thing about Dara is that she's a very good writer, and also the Vox format of articles is so cool. It lays things out so well. You should go and find it, read it, catch up on all this stuff. When you're not training a cat to be dog-like or exploring all the avenues of Senate rhetoric, you also cover immigration stuff a lot, right?
Yes.
So one thing that's interesting to me is that there are other things going on this planet besides this ongoing presidential scandal storm sweeping through Washington. So what do you got for me on immigration front? What's new in that world?
So where we are on immigration right now is that there are kind of things that are bubbling up that might potentially happen in future, which is just kind of rumor world. And then there's family separation, which is still, the family separation policy has ended, but because of the, because at one point over 2,500 families were separated and have not all been reunited, despite the judge's deadline in the federal court case that was filed over this that did result in, 2,000 or so families being reunited, but the rest of them not. We're kind of in end game on that, but the end game is A, not yet resulting in the reunification of all families, and B, raising some real questions about what happened during the months that this policy was in full effect and what that meant for people's rights and also the administration.
Just break it down. There are kids still have not been reunited with their parents.
There are
their parents
hundred.
Still don't know where their kids are.
Yeah, we're talking about a bit over 500, slightly over 500 families.
So that is an ongoing crisis still.
Yeah, it's the reason that this gets complicated is that it's not that the government is just holding 500 families and refusing to, let them see their kids. What's happening is that the government has said, look, these are families who it's particularly hard to reunite or who we have decided it's a bad idea to reunite, or who signed papers saying it's okay if I don't see my child again. It's okay if I go back to my home country and my child stays in the U.S. because the independent when they were separated, the child was put in an independent court process that has a better likelihood of them ultimately being able to stay.
Okay.
So, one of the questions that's come up in the aftermath of this is, what happens once children are reunited with their parents? Do they get to stay in that process? Do they have to get sent back to their home country because their parent has been ordered deported? Who makes that decision? In over 100 cases, parents already said it's okay if my child stays in the U.S. and I go back. Those parents, many of them are now saying, I didn't understand what I was signing. I was told that if I signed a paper allowing myself to get deported, I would see my child again. They were not informed. There was also, a case that I wrote about that happened last month where parents were told that they had to sign papers saying that their child would get deported with them. And if they refused and said, no, I really want my child to be able to stay in the U.S., they were separated from their children again without being able to say goodbye or anything. There are lots of stories that even though ostensibly on paper, a parent is waiving a right to do X or Y, in practice, that choice is being coerced out of them. And so that has resulted in the government saying, well, these don't count as families we have to reunite. They've already waived their rights. Or in about 400 cases, although some of those overlap with the waivers, the parent has already been deported. In about 350 cases, there was no waiver of rights. The parent got deported anyway. And now the question is, whose job is it to find those parents and ask them what they want for their kids? The government has said that it's the job of the ACLU and non-governmental organizations to do it. The ACLU says, are you freaking kidding us? We can't, we have networks, but we can't do this on their own. Last night, they filed, both the government and the ACLU kind of filed updates, and the ACLU's update said that many of the phone numbers that the government gave them saying this is where we think deported parents are don't work, or no one was there, or they can't reach anybody. They're coming to, even though this is, again, I say we're in endgame here. We're talking about a population of 400 out of, 2,600 or so. It is diminishing, but it's not clear how much it's going to continue diminishing, just because no one really knows how you get to a large number of those 400 separated parents. And the kind of questions about coercion are kind of overlapping with that, right? Because that has implications for what happens once those parents are contacted. What rights do they have? Are they, the ACLU says that some of them should be allowed to come back to the U.S. while their children are still going through the court process, because the kids have a right to stay, to have their parents.
And the kids
around.
Kids are still in shelters now. They're in
some of them
foster care.
In cases where the government doesn't think that they can reach parents, in particular, the kids are often being placed in medium-term foster care or in Office of Refugee Resettlement shelters. The government isn't counting cases where they've placed the child with a relative who's not their parent. That is essentially counting as a reunification. And that does happen to a lot of kids who come across the border without parents. So it's possible that some kids are not with their parents, but are with aunts or uncles or cousins. But there are cases in which kids were kind of placed very quickly with foster parents or foster families. There are lots of cases in which parents were told that their child, having been taken away from them, was just going to be adopted. One of the more recent court filings has charged that one mother was spent her asylum interview asking the asylum officer where her child was. And the asylum officer just said, watch the news. We've known for a while that there wasn't really information about how parents and kids could get in touch with each other. What we're beginning to see over the last couple of weeks are two things. We're seeing, kind of confirmation that the government not only didn't have a plan in place, but didn't see it as a problem that there wasn't a plan. Jonathan Blitzer of The New Yorker wrote a piece this week where he interviewed a government official who's kind of witnessed a lot of this. And the official said that no one thought this was going to be a big deal. They thought that families were going to be separated, the kids were going to be put into, sent to the Office of Refugee Resettlement to be treated as if they'd come across the border alone. The parents would get deported, and no one would make a big deal out of it. And they were really surprised that it turned out a large swath of the American public thought it was not cool to separate families who had come to the U.S. together. That's not great, given that the Trump administration at the time was saying this is only a temporary situation, that they were saying, we're temporarily doing this because we can't keep parents and kids together in criminal custody. And, we have to send the parents to criminal custody. If they were saying that, on the externally, but internally thought that the outcome was going to be permanent separation, that's kind of a consequence that wasn't getting presented at the time.
So we're still kind of in the middle of a lot of that stuff is still going on.
We are, but
and
it's not
a little bit off the media radar now because of all this other stuff. But
and also because it's not clear how you fix it, right? Like the lawsuits that have been filed on kind of coercing parents. One of them.
This is a huge mess was created.
Yeah,
and cleaning up this huge mess has been proven extremely difficult.
Right. And it's been extremely difficult both because it's really hard to generate records after the fact when you didn't keep them at the time, and because people who aren't in the U.S. don't have a lot of rights. People who are in the U.S. but who are going through the asylum process, there's not a lot of judicial oversight of that. It's really well established that you don't get to appeal your asylum claim to a federal judge.
Got it.
So, some of these families have kind of had to sue under a provision to stop the entire policy. And even if they win that suit, that's just 30 families. It's not clear what happens to the other hundreds of families who had to go through the same process, who, failed interviews because they didn't understand where their children were and couldn't answer the questions.
I got to wrap you up, but Dara Lind from Vox, read it, follow it.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Dan Kaufman and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.